In the spring of 1922, on an isolated farm in rural Bavaria, an entire family was murdered by an intruder who, in the days before the killings, had left behind signs that he was watching them, and who, in the days after, apparently continued living on the farm itself before vanishing without a trace. 6 people died. Footprints were found leading toward the house, but never leading away. And more than a century later, despite renewed forensic investigation using techniques the original detectives could never have imagined, the killer's identity remains completely unknown. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck Murders, one of the most unsettling, unsolved cases in German criminal history. The farm at the center of the case, known as Hinterkaifeck, sat in a remote, sparsely populated area of Bavaria, roughly 40 miles north of Munich, isolated enough that its nearest neighboring settlement lay a meaningful walking distance away, separated by open farmland and patches of forest that left the property considerably more cut off from casual observation or passing traffic than most farms in the surrounding region. The farm was owned and worked by Andreas Gruber, a 63-year-old farmer, along with his wife Kazilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, and Victoria's 2 children, a 7-year-old daughter named Kazilia and a 2-year-old son named Joseph, along with a maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had only recently been hired to help with household work on the farm, having started her position just days before the murders occurred. The household itself was not without its own complicated and, at the time, locally gossiped about history. Victoria's husband had died several years earlier, and rumors within the surrounding rural community had long persisted suggesting that Victoria's young son, Joseph, may not have been fathered by her deceased husband at all, but rather by her own father, Andreas Gruber, allegations that, if true, would have represented a deeply scandalous and taboo circumstance within the conservative rural Catholic community the family lived within, and which, whether accurate or not, had reportedly generated considerable local gossip and speculation about the family's private circumstances well before the murders themselves ever occurred. Andreas Gruber had, according to some later historical accounts, faced formal accusations related to this alleged relationship at an earlier point, adding a documented layer of scandal and tension to the family's standing within their local community. In the days immediately preceding the murders, Andreas Gruber reported to acquaintances and neighbors a series of strange and unsettling incidents occurring around the farm. Details that, once the murders were discovered, took on considerably more ominous significance in hindsight than they likely carried at the time they were originally reported. Gruber told others that he had discovered a newspaper on the property that did not belong to the household and that no family member could account for. He reported finding a set of footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the surrounding forest directly toward the farmhouse, but notably, with no corresponding footprints leading back away from the property, suggesting whoever had made them was either still present somewhere on the grounds or had left by some means that didn't involve retracing the same visible path. He also reported hearing footsteps in the farmhouse's attic on multiple occasions, along with other unexplained sounds that suggested, at least in retrospect, someone may have been secretly present on or around the property in the days leading up to the murders, watching the family or otherwise preparing for what would eventually occur. Despite these reported incidents, which Gruber apparently discussed with at least a few acquaintances and neighbors in the surrounding area, the family did not take any documented additional precautions or formally report their concerns to local police prior to the murders, a detail that, like much of the case, has remained the subject of considerable historical speculation, given how directly these reported strange occurrences would later appear to foreshadow the violence that followed. On the last confirmed date the family was known to still be alive, March 31st, 1922, the maid Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm to begin her new position, replacing a previous household servant who had recently left the position after reportedly telling others she believed the farmhouse was haunted, citing unexplained sounds and a persistent, unsettling atmosphere she had experienced during her time working there. Another detail that, once the murders became known, contributed considerably to the case's enduring reputation for genuine, documented strangeness extending beyond simply the murders themselves. The exact sequence of events on the night the family was killed has never been definitively established, though the physical evidence eventually recovered by investigators allowed for a reasonably confident general reconstruction of what likely occurred. Investigators believe that Victoria's daughter, young Kazilia, along with her grandmother Kazilia Gruber and possibly other family members, were lured or led out to the farm's barn one at a time, where they were then killed using a mattock, a farming tool with a pickaxe-like design commonly used for digging and breaking ground, an implement investigators determined had been taken directly from the farm's own tool shed, suggesting the killer had either specifically sought out an available weapon, already present on the property, or had deliberately chosen to use a farm implement rather than bringing his own weapon to the scene, a detail some investigators have suggested may indicate the killer's familiarity with the property's layout and available tools. Based on the physical evidence and the eventual timeline reconstructed by investigators, it appears the murders were not confined to a single moment, but rather occurred in stages, with family members apparently killed individually, potentially over a period extending across parts of 2 separate days, based on later evidence suggesting some household activities, including apparent evidence that the family's animals had continued to be fed and cared for, continued for at least a short period. After the initial killings began, a detail that would come to represent one of the case's most genuinely disturbing and difficult to fully explain elements. The bodies of Andreas Gruber, Kazilia Gruber, Victoria Gabriel, and young Kazilia were discovered in the farm's barn, arranged in a manner investigators determined was consistent with each having been individually lured to that specific location before being attacked, rather than having been killed together in a single, simultaneous assault. The bodies of the maid, Maria Baumgartner, and the youngest child, 2-year-old Joseph, were found within the farmhouse itself, with young Joseph's cause of death eventually determined to have most likely been suffocation, a particularly disturbing detail given his young age and the apparent method used, which investigators believe suggested he may have been killed after the other family members, potentially having survived alone in the house for some period following the initial attack on the rest of the family in the barn. The murders were not discovered immediately, despite the significant number of victims involved, largely due to the farm's isolated location and the fact that neighbors, while eventually noticing the family's unusual and prolonged absence from typical community activities and obligations, initially assumed the Grubers had simply been occupied with farm work or other private matters, rather than immediately suspecting anything seriously amiss. It was not until several days after the murders are now believed to have occurred that concerned neighbors and local acquaintances, growing increasingly uneasy about the family's continued and uncharacteristic absence, finally visited the farm directly to check on the household, where they discovered the full scope of what had happened. What investigators found upon finally entering the property, beyond the 6 bodies themselves, added considerably to the case's already unsettling character. Evidence within the farmhouse strongly suggested that someone, presumably the killer, had continued living on the property for some period following the murders, based on findings including food that had apparently been prepared and consumed after the family's deaths, a fire that had continued to be maintained in the farmhouse's stove, and livestock that had continued to be fed, cared for, and in some accounts, milked, well after the point investigators believed the murders themselves had occurred. This evidence, taken together, has remained one of the single most disturbing and most extensively discussed elements of the entire case, suggesting that whoever committed the murders did not simply flee the scene immediately afterward, as investigators might typically expect in the case of an isolated, opportunistic attack, but instead remained on the property, living among the bodies of his victims, for a period that some estimates place at several days, before eventually leaving the farm and, apparently, vanishing entirely. The original 1922 police investigation, conducted by Bavarian authorities working with what were, by the standards of the era, reasonably competent and thorough investigative methods, pursued numerous leads and considered a range of potential suspects. Though the case's remote rural setting and the significant forensic and investigative limitations of the period ultimately prevented investigators from developing sufficient evidence to formally charge any specific individual with the murders. Among the suspects considered during the original investigation, and by researchers who have continued examining the case in the decades since, was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a local farmer and acquaintance of the Gruber family who, notably, was widely believed within the local community to be the actual biological father of Victoria's younger child, Joseph, a circumstance that, if accurate, would have provided at least a theoretically plausible personal motive connected to the family's documented internal tensions and complicated relationships. Schlittenbauer was among the first individuals to enter the farm after the murders were discovered, and some later researchers examining the case have raised questions about certain aspects of his documented behavior and statements during the initial investigation, though no conclusive evidence was ever developed sufficient to formally charge him, and he maintained his innocence throughout the remainder of his life. Beyond Schlittenbauer, investigators and later researchers have considered a range of additional theories over the decades, including the possibility that the murders were committed by a stranger or itinerant laborer entirely unconnected to the family's existing personal relationships and community tensions. Potentially someone who had been the source of the strange occurrences Andreas Gruber had reported in the days before the murders, and who may have specifically targeted the isolated farm for reasons that were never definitively established, whether related to robbery, given some reports that money on the property may have gone missing, though this detail has remained a subject of some historical uncertainty, or for reasons that remain entirely unknown given the absence of any confirmed suspect or motive ever conclusively established. The case remained formally unsolved throughout the remainder of the 20th century, receiving periodic renewed attention from both German law enforcement and independent researchers and historians who continued to examine the surviving case files, though the significant passage of time, combined with the substantial forensic and investigative limitations that characterized the original 1922 investigation, meant that developing genuinely new, actionable leads became increasingly difficult as the decades passed and any individuals with direct, first-hand knowledge relevant to the murders grew increasingly unlikely to still be alive. In more recent years, the case has drawn renewed academic and forensic interest, including efforts by criminology students and researchers at German universities to re-examine the case using modern investigative and forensic analysis techniques applied to the surviving historical evidence and documentation from the original 1922 investigation, efforts that have, in some instances, generated renewed theories regarding the killer's likely identity and motive, though none of this more recent analysis has produced anything resembling a definitive, conclusively proven resolution to the case, given the fundamental limitations inherent in re-examining physical evidence and documentation more than a century removed from the crimes themselves, without access to the kind of preserved physical or biological evidence that has allowed genetic genealogy techniques to successfully resolve certain other historical cold cases in recent years. The Hinterkaifeck farm itself was, following the conclusion of the original investigation, eventually demolished, a decision reportedly made at least in part due to the significant number of curious visitors and, in some documented accounts, individuals attempting to remove items from the property as souvenirs connected to the case, behavior that local authorities and the family's surviving relatives apparently found sufficiently disruptive and disrespectful to ultimately justify the property's complete demolition, removing the physical structure itself from the landscape entirely. Though the case's location and general history have remained well documented and continue to draw significant ongoing interest from researchers and true crime enthusiasts, both within Germany and increasingly, in more recent decades, from an international audience that has discovered the case through various documentaries, articles, and other media exploring some of history's most enduring unsolved murders. What makes the Hinterkaifeck case particularly unsettling, even when considered alongside numerous other unsolved historical murders, is the specific combination of details that, taken together, suggest a killer who was neither a purely opportunistic, transient attacker passing through unfamiliar territory, nor someone motivated by a straightforward, easily identifiable personal grievance or dispute. The reported strange occurrences in the days before the murders, the apparent staged or deliberate luring of individual family members to the barn rather than a single, simultaneous attack, and most disturbingly, the evidence suggesting the killer remained on the property for a period afterward, living among his victims' remains before eventually disappearing entirely, together paint a picture of a crime characterized by a level of calculation, patience, and disturbing personal comfort with the aftermath of extreme violence that has continued to unsettle both professional investigators and the broader public who have encountered the case in the more than 100 years since it occurred. More than a century after the murders at Hinterkaifeck, the case remains formally unsolved within German criminal records. Its central and most fundamental questions, who committed the murders, and why, never definitively answered despite periodic renewed investigative and forensic attention over the decades. What remains is a case whose surviving historical documentation, combined with the specific, deeply unsettling physical evidence recovered from the scene itself, continues to generate genuine scholarly and public interest more than 100 years later. A reminder that even in an era of vastly more advanced forensic and investigative capability, some of history's most disturbing crimes remain permanently, and perhaps irretrievably, out of reach of any conclusive resolution.